When I was researching the story of Benedict Arnold, I couldn't help but be reminded and draw comparisons to the story of the television show Breaking Bad, specifically the character of Walter White. So if you haven't seen Breaking Bad, you might not get the reference, but I'm sure you know enough about it from just pop culture references to understand the basics. And if you haven't seen Breaking Bad, then what are you doing? You need to get on that pronto. Breaking Bad is the story of a middle-aged man named Walter White who decides to break bad one day for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to spoil. He decides he's going to start, essentially selling drugs, getting involved in all sorts of shady, violent activity. And of course, he sees this as all kind of working towards the common good. Now, one of the lenses to view the show in and view the show through is this lens of nature versus nurture. So what is the ultimate cause of a person's behavior? Is it their genetics, their biology, kind of what they are on the inside? Is that the main determining factor? Or is it the nurture factor? Is it the environment? Is it the people around you and the influences and the events that happen to you that ultimately decide what you end up doing? So in Breaking Bad, was he always going to be that guy? Was he always that guy on the inside and events just kind of manifested where that allowed him to show who he was? Or did those events shape him and create that ultimate bad guy that we see by the end of the show? So bringing this back to Benedict Arnold, by the end of this story, as I'm sure we all know, he's going to be that traitor, that bad guy, the guy who betrays his country. But what are the ultimate causes of that? Why did he end up doing it? That's something we're going to explore in the episode. So what if Benedict Arnold had never escaped at Valcour Island? What if he had never gotten injured at the Battle of Saratoga, which we're going to see plays a significant role in his later decision-making? What if he never gets married to Peggy Shippen, who is going to play a huge role in this story? So there's all these what-ifs and all these environmental factors. Did he betray his country because of those factors? Or did he betray his country because he was just a bad guy and it was just a matter of time before it happened? Or before he did something else, more sinister or less sinister? So this nature versus nurture debate that has perplexed philosophers and psychologists and historians for a long time is kind of one way to look at this story of Benedict Arnold. And as you're kind of listening to all the reasons why he got involved in all the stuff he did and all the events, it might be useful to think about this story through that lens. When you reach the conclusion of Breaking Bad, I'm not going to spoil it here for you, but when you reach that conclusion, you find out the answer to that question. Is it nature versus nurture for Walter White? So the question now becomes, what's it going to be for Benedict Arnold? When we last left Benedict Arnold, he was one of the heroes of the Battle of Saratoga, which of course occurs in late 1777, big American victory over the British, and really starts to turn the tide of the war in a lot of ways. So Benedict Arnold kind of had that big heroic charge. A lot of people credit him with, being influential in turning the tide of that battle. And of course, he has that crazy suicidal charge, we'll call it, which ends, of course, with him getting injured and basically being knocked out of commission. So here's Benedict Arnold. He's lying around. His leg is significantly injured from the battle. He's got gout in the other leg. He's got all sorts of battle injuries, scars, wounds, etc. At this point, he's probably hopped up on a lot of painkillers, maybe some alcohol, maybe a mix of both. And he's kind of battling back these feelings of resentment and depression and anger. These feelings of anger and resentment are built up towards that Continental Congress that decided they weren't going to give him that raise. They weren't going to give him that promotion. And Benedict Arnold felt slighted by this. So he's given all of this for his country. and the least they could do in his eyes was give him the respect he deserves, which comes with the benefits, okay, the promotions, the raises, etc. So Benedict Arnold was building up that resentment as he was getting injured here, okay, and after he got injured. So this is a key factor and something to keep in mind as we look at his later decisions. Another thing that Benedict Arnold was doing during this time period where he was injured and, depressed and angry and resentful was he was writing letter after letter after letter to that Betsy DuBois girl. Okay, so she was the girl who he had that crush on, and she kind of rejected him. So here's what Benedict Arnold says in one of his letters, quote, 20 times have I taken my pen to write you, and as often has my trembling hand refused to obey the dictates of my heart, end quote. Okay, so Benedict Arnold is writing letter after letter after letter to this poor girl, and she's just ignoring him. So she's basically ghosting him at this point. And Arnold is kind of getting more and more upset that she's not talking to him. He's convincing himself that he loves her, even though it's pretty obvious that there's no reason for that and she doesn't reciprocate the feelings. So this is all contributing to Benedict Arnold's kind of unstable frame of mind at this point. Now, elsewhere in the war, George Washington was having a tough time. So they just won that battle at Saratoga, okay, but the British are still in a pretty good position. They have Philadelphia under their control. They have New York under their control. And really with one fell swoop, if the British decided to, okay, they could end this war at this point. Okay, if they executed and if they came up with a plan that was effective, they could easily be in a position where the United States would have to negotiate. So George Washington's in a little bit of hurt, okay, and he's in Valley Forge for the winter of 77 and 78, and it's cold, it's snowy, okay, his men are resentful, his men are on the brink of mutiny because there's no food, there's no rations, it's cold, they have no uniforms. So Benedict Arnold is someone that George Washington needs, okay, here's a general who, if you could take an opinion poll of the colonists in the country, and even some of the loyalists, honestly, his approval rating would be through the roof, okay? He was seen as the hero of Saratoga. He was a guy who went out there and, spoke with actions. Actions speak louder than words. So George Washington wanted Benedict Arnold on his side, and he wanted him back in action as soon as possible. Here's George Washington talking about Benedict Arnold, basically asking him to come back, get ready for action. Quote, "May I venture to ask whether you are upon your legs again? There is none who wishes more sincerely for this event than I do, or who will receive the information with more pleasure." End quote. So George Washington needs competent generals. He needs guys that are going to, the troops are going to rally around, and Benedict Arnold is one of those guys. So Benedict Arnold had George Washington's trust, and that's not something that was easily gained by a guy of George Washington's stature. So George Washington asked Benedict Arnold to become the military governor of Philadelphia. So the British had taken control of Philadelphia, but then they basically just evacuated because they didn't see the strategic sense in staying there for the long haul. And they evacuate. George Washington needs someone who can go in there, kind of reestablish law and order and get things moving effectively while he has time to kind of figure out what he's going to do next for the war. So Benedict Arnold accepts. He kind of is still injured, but he, wants to serve his country, and he wants to help out Washington. And so Benedict Arnold travels to Philadelphia to take over this military governorship. And if you remember from last time, one of the things about Benedict Arnold was he was a pretty wealthy man before the Revolutionary War started. And he actually dumped a lot of that wealth and a lot of that, resources into the Revolutionary War effort, and he wasn't exactly getting paid well, and he wasn't exactly getting those resources and that wealth back from the war. So I think, people forget in the old days, ancient times, even somewhat modern times, one of the perks of going to war is that if you win, you can take the other people's stuff. Okay, you can go on raiding missions, looting, okay, et cetera, all that stuff. Now, I'm not saying Benedict Arnold was that guy, but it might have been a motivation for him to get so heavily involved in the war in the first place. Now, by this point in the war, he's definitely not doing so well financially. So one of the perks of taking this job is that he's now the highest law and order official in the city of Philadelphia. And the British have just evacuated. So they've left behind supplies, they've left behind materials, they've left behind some wealth in that city. So by the letter of the law, Benedict Arnold is supposed to get that stuff, turn it over to the Continental Army, turn it over to George Washington, turn it over to the Continental Congress, and then, they can divide it up for the army, for the people, etc. Now, Benedict Arnold thinks differently. Okay, so he's going to get into a deal with some smugglers, and he's basically going to set up a situation where he can profit off of all those goods that were left in the city. So he goes ahead and takes a share of them. Okay, he sells them off either to the British or to some other people who are just looking for those types of materials, and Benedict Arnold starts building up that wealth again. So it's important to keep in mind that this was, by the letter of the law, at least some light treason, if you've ever seen Arrested Development. But this light treason he's involved in, Benedict Arnold feels that these are losses that he owes recouped to him. Okay, so he feels he's paid his dues, he's gotten injured in the battlefield, and he never got what he thought he was going to get out of the war. So Benedict Arnold never thought twice about doing these kind of shady transactions and engaging in smuggling and this kind of sketchy activity. So he didn't think twice about it, and he felt like, you know what, if they're not going to pay me, if they're not going to recoup me for what I've lost in this war, I'm going to do it myself. Another thing that we need to remember about Benedict Arnold is he's a man of action. Okay, he's not a guy who's going to sit there and just be some sort of bureaucrat who rules over a city and just, does nothing and, collects a paycheck. He wants to be in the action. Okay, so Benedict Arnold proposes a plan, and his plan is this. He wants to get on a ship, okay, with some members of the army and with some, basically pirates. He wants to go down to Bermuda and Barbados, and he wants to free a bunch of slaves there, take them up into the colonies, and then use those slaves as extra fighters to fight against the British. So this wasn't the first time an idea like this had been proposed, but the fact that Benedict Arnold was, thinking about a plan as adventurous as this is, it goes to show how he was not very happy just kind of sitting idly by and letting the war go by him. Okay, he wanted a piece of the action, and he wanted to be part of the plan. Now, if that plan ever came to fruition, that would be a heck of a story and probably worthy of a podcast episode for sure. But George Washington actually shoots this plan down, probably not because of any feelings about slavery, but more about just the logistics of it and, how it fit into his overall plan for the war. It just wasn't a good plan for him. So with that plan to go free some slaves and be a pirate and, kick some butt, that plan shot down, Benedict Arnold is left to the reality of cleaning up the situation in Philadelphia. Okay, and there is a situation in Philadelphia, and it's this. A lot of people forget that the Revolutionary War, like a lot of revolutionary wars, is also kind of a civil war in its own way. So it wasn't just that, on one day, on 1776, July 4th, all of the colonists decided, you know what, we're all in this together, we're going to go fight the British. Boom, Revolutionary War, British versus colonists. Okay, that wasn't the way it was. So inside the colonies, you actually had a divide between the people. So some of the people were loyalists, some of the people were staunch revolutionaries, some people were in the middle, okay, and then you had people who kind of leaned to one side or the other. So this kind of situation meant that not all people in the colonies could really trust each other. There was some tension, there was some violence, okay, and it kind of reminds you of revolutionary France in a way, obviously not to that extent, but certain pockets, that's what it reminds you of. So in Philadelphia, we had what was known as the Constitutionalists, and we had what was known as the Republicans. Okay, so the Constitutionalists are more of the kind of radical group. They're more associated with the colonists. They want independence. They're more associated with, all the freedoms associated with that, etc. Now, the Republicans, these guys are more of the kind of wealthy, elite that were already in place. They probably lean a little bit towards the British, so they're a little bit more loyalist leaning. okay, and they're a little less egalitarian. So those constitutionalists were kind of more radical, egalitarian, let's spread the wealth out, okay, and those Republicans, not so much, okay, they kind of wanted the old guard, the status quo. And of course, the Republicans were feeling good when the British were taking, in control of the city because, obviously they were leaning towards the Loyalist faction. They were, leaning a little more pro-British, and the Constitutionalists were the ones who kind of had to worry. But now that the script was flipped, okay, now that the British are out of Philadelphia and it's the Continental Army back in charge, the Constitutionalists are the ones who are in charge. Okay, and you can see they're actually persecuting Republicans. There's some violence. There's some threats of violence. We can imagine what this might have looked like based on some of the stuff we see in the modern day, and honestly, some of the stuff that we're going to talk about here in a second. And in the midst of this situation in Philadelphia, Benedict Arnold falls in love again with somebody else. Okay, so her name is Peggy Shippen, and surprise, surprise, she's an 18-year-old girl from Philadelphia, obviously, and she kind of leans, and her family leans more towards that Republican side of the spectrum. So Peggy Shippen is pretty much an unabashed loyalist, and she definitely associates with the Republican crowd. Okay, so Benedict Arnold, whether he was trying to impress her or whether he had other motives, basically he starts hanging out with those Republicans. Okay, so these are kind of the richer crowd. He starts throwing these big rich parties. Okay, he goes from place to place in the city on carriages. All right, he kind of starts living life a little bit more extravagantly. Okay, so in his view, just because you came from wealth or have wealth doesn't mean that, you're a bad person or anything like that. So what he saw was constitutionalists persecuting Republicans, and he didn't see why this was happening, and he didn't understand it, and he didn't like it. So what Benedict Arnold saw was that once the Republicans were removed from power and the Constitutionalists took power, those radicals, okay, the Republicans started getting persecuted, and we started seeing violence and even, some pretty bad things happening, like deaths and murders and things like that. So what Arnold recognized was that a lot of the time in warfare, and specifically in, revolutionary or civil warfare, what you have is a group of people who are trying to remove somebody from power because of perceived oppression. And this is what was happening, for the colonists with the British. They're trying to remove them because of those oppressions that we'll learn about when we look at the causes of the Revolutionary War. So a lot of times what actually happens is that once that reactionary group gets into power, they start persecuting the other group, and the situation turns out worse. The response to the situation is even worse than the actual situation to begin with. So Benedict Arnold recognized this, and he didn't want the Constitutionalists to just totally run roughshod over the Republicans, because he felt that, again, a lot of times that reaction to the perceived slights, the perceived aggressions is actually worse than the aggressions and slights to begin with. So if you're familiar with the French Revolution, okay, you might agree with this sentiment. Once those reactionary radicals, those Jacobins got into power, okay, they started doing things that were even worse than what was happening originally. So Benedict Arnold recognized this, and he didn't want situations to erupt and get really bad. And by the way, just as an aside, here's what George Washington thought about these party disputes that were happening really all over the country, but specifically in Philadelphia. He says, quote, "Party disputes and personal quarrels are the great business of the day. Whilst the momentous concerns of an empire, a great and accumulated debt, ruined finances, depreciated money, want of credit, are but secondary considerations and postponed from day to day, from week to week." End quote. So George Washington understood that if we kind of separate ourselves into parties and we start developing into factions and start fighting with each other, okay, we're going to lose sight of the common goal. We're going to lose sight of why we came together to begin with, and we're going to lose sight, ultimately, of our purpose and common ground together. So George Washington did not like these party disputes, and it's something that a lot of historians have looked back on and said, if only we had heeded George Washington's warnings, perhaps a lot of the problems in our current political climate would have been avoided. Ultimately, in the midst of all this, Benedict Arnold is able to quell the tensions for the most part and prevent any sort of, significant event from occurring in Philadelphia related to these party kind of disputes. What he is going to do at the time is marry Peggy Shippen. Okay, so remember, she's that British Republican, British-leaning loyalist, and he's going to gain access to all her contacts and all her resources, which will become important later. So the next thing that happens is that the constitutionalists in the city actually bring charges against Benedict Arnold. So they knew he was doing the smuggling. They knew he was doing the kind of shady light treason that he was doing. And Benedict Arnold received those charges from the constitutionalists. It involved, taking things, stealing money, smuggling, all those types of things. And he was basically accused of treason. So it was essentially at this point that Benedict Arnold decides he's going to become a traitor. And he's going to start negotiating with the British, and he's going to start seeing what he can get for himself as a result of that. There's basically a handful of reasons why Benedict Arnold ultimately makes that decision to become a traitor and start negotiating with the British. So the first one has to do with money. Okay, first and foremost, it's got to be the money situation. So Benedict Arnold was living a pretty extravagant lifestyle in Philadelphia. He was associating with those Republicans. He was trying to impress Peggy Shippen, his wife, and he needed money to kind of support this lifestyle. He moved into a big house, and he thought this would impress Peggy, but turns out he couldn't really afford it, so he needed that stream of money, and the smuggling and the Continental Army just wasn't doing it for him. So he looked to the British to be able to provide that for him in exchange for some key intel. Okay, the second thing was that Benedict Arnold lost that leg to injury. Okay, he didn't lose the leg physically, but he was unable to walk on it for the most part. He had gout in the other leg. He was unable to walk. Okay, so to have this man of action doing nothing but sitting around, okay, this isn't going to help his demeanor. So Benedict Arnold's that man of action, and when he can't do that, he can't be that man of action, okay, bad things are going to happen. And that's what we see when he kind of starts reaching out to the British. Okay, next, he's got this disillusionment with the Continental Congress. Okay, he's got this resentment towards the people who are, believe it or not, actually thinking about court-martialing him. Okay, the Army's thinking about court-martialing him for these perceived crimes. He's already fending off accusations of stealing and stuff, so he feels that the government and the Continental Congress in particular don't respect what he did, and they, he's basically flabbergasted that after all he's done for his country, they would still do this to him. And then the last thing that's key and is something that has to be said is that he might have turned traitor solely because of Peggy Shippen. Okay, and she was certainly a factor, if not the most important factor. So she was an unabashed loyalist. Okay, so she believed that the colonies had no right to exist, and she had those British contacts that Benedict Arnold was going to use to try and become that traitor and get that money that he needed. So what do you do when you have an oath to your country, okay, which Benedict Arnold did, and he swore on the Bible that he was going to uphold his oath to his country, but you also have an oath to your wife, okay, who's a loyalist and probably wants him to start working against his own country. So when those two oaths conflict, Benedict Arnold is going to end up siding with his family, with his wife, and this will lead to disastrous consequences. So Benedict Arnold makes this decision to become a traitor, but he never accepts that he's committing treason. So he justifies everything he does, and when he does this justification, he's not holding himself to any sort of higher ethical standard. He's just kind of groveling in that base layer of just resentment and anger and basically self-preservation. So Benedict Arnold was not holding himself to that higher kind of ethical thought process. He was just interested in providing for himself, providing for his family, and because he felt justified in doing that, that's exactly what he ends up doing. So Benedict Arnold has made the decision. he's going to turn traitor. He's going to betray his country. He's going to betray the oaths that he swore, betray the men that fought with him, that fought for him, and he's going to go over to the British. So he gets with Peggy, his wife, and she has those contacts in the British Army, and her family has those contacts. So Benedict Arnold starts exchanging coded messages, with the commands for the British. So the initial plan is that the British want Benedict Arnold to gain control of a large number of troops. Remember, he is a major general, and they want him to essentially just surrender those troops over to the British. So maybe 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. And with that move, that would be a significant help, obviously, to the British. So the plan is for Benedict Arnold to gain control of some amount of troops, and then the British will capture them, essentially. So Benedict Arnold actually does one better. He gets command of a fortress known as West Point, which is near New York, which in 1780 is being controlled by the British. And this American fortress is key to kind of keeping control of that region that they had won during the Battle of Saratoga. So preventing the British from kind of moving in certain strategic directions to the northwest. So Benedict Arnold has control at West Point, and at any one time at West Point, you could have as many as 3,000 or more men in the fort. And if Benedict Arnold turns this thing over to the British, that could be a significant blow. But what's more is that if the British were able to attack, and Benedict Arnold was able to execute his treachery effectively, if they were able to attack on September 23rd, 1780, not only will he have 3,000 or more men at the fort, but he'll also have George Washington there. So folks, if you capture 3,000 of the opposition's men and their commanding officer in one fell swoop without losing a ton of manpower, you probably just won the war. So a very real possibility here that the British could have won this war in one fell swoop with that plan. So all that was left for Benedict Arnold was to come up with the details, the exact plan, tell the British exactly where the fort was weak, tell the British exactly where the men would be stationed and kind of how to get through and what the exact negotiations were going to be. And of course, how much money am I going to get for doing this? So Benedict Arnold very concerned with the money aspect of that negotiation. So neither side really wanted to communicate such pertinent information over, just sending letters. Of course, they didn't have text messages or emails or anything like that. So neither side wanted to send information by letter because it could be captured, confiscated, false, forged, whatever. So both sides agreed they had to meet. And after a few tries, Benedict Arnold says, listen, if you guys want to make this happen, you guys got to come to me. So the British send their head of intelligence, basically their head of their spy network, a guy by the name of John Andre, to a night meeting with Benedict Arnold, with essentially the Revolutionary War hanging in the balance. Benedict Arnold is able to sneak away from where he's supposed to be for long enough to meet John Andre, but the negotiations take too long, and Benedict Arnold is too concerned with how much money he's going to get, and apparently that was a big thing that made the negotiations last long. They last for hours and hours and hours instead of just lasting for a couple of minutes, and all of a sudden it's starting to get light outside. So Benedict Arnold essentially has to stash this John Andre guy somewhere where he's not going to be found. Now, Andre is actually wearing his British officer's uniform. He's wearing a big overcoat over that to disguise it, but he's still wearing his uniform, which probably seems like a dumb move, but if you get caught in your officer's uniform, there's a different punishment from if you got caught doing this without your officer's uniform on. So in Andre's view, if he got caught, he wouldn't be punished as severely. This is going to turn out to bite him in the butt pretty badly, but that was his logic. So once the negotiations are over, Benedict Arnold essentially orders a couple of men to escort John Andre out of American territory and back into British territory. So he tells them that he's a spy working for Benedict Arnold, who's working for George Washington. So these two men who end up escorting John Andre are none the wiser, and they escort him to the brink of neutral territory between the American and British territory, and they let him go. And John Andre walks into British territory, and he sees what he thinks are British guards. And they're actually German guards, but they're working for the British. So they're in that Germanic Hessian uniform. And he reveals himself as a Brit, and he says, "Take me to your leader." Okay, the problem was this was a bad idea because these guys were actually American spies dressed up as German officers. So now they just have a guy who revealed himself as a Brit. They search him. They find the documents that Benedict Arnold had given him with all the information about the plan and the treachery and the betrayal. And the jig is up at this point. The documents get sent to George Washington. Andre gets sent to prison, essentially, where he would later be executed. Once Benedict Arnold hears about John Andre being captured, he flees to New York, turns himself over to the British, abandoning his men. And presumably him and Peggy had talked about the plan, but possibly abandoning his family as well. So he turns himself over to the British. Ultimately, the plan, Benedict Arnold's plan of turning over West Point and turning the tide of the war, is foiled, and the Republic is saved for now. Benedict Arnold would serve out a few years in the British Army. So he was placed in command of a number of men, was involved in a number of battles, and was actually involved in some even more sinister activities, but that's a story for another day. Peggy Shippen, Benedict Arnold's wife, was basically accused of being part of the action that Benedict Arnold was getting in on, being a traitor as well. But she pleads insanity, so she had these spells of just total insanity where she would yell things and scream things and have nervous breakdowns. And either that was happening and they just sent her back to Benedict Arnold, or she pretended to be doing that in order to plead insanity, essentially. So either way, she pleads insanity. The American forces are nice enough to send her back to Benedict Arnold, so they're reunited. And Benedict Arnold would live out his days in London, essentially working as a merchant, kind of mercenary pirate hybrid that he kind of always wanted to be. George Washington was clearly crushed by the betrayal of Benedict Arnold, and he wanted Benedict Arnold to pay. So they were able to hang John Andre, the other conspirator in this, intelligence operation. But they never got to Arnold. And George Washington sent agents out towards the end of the war trying to get Benedict Arnold, capture him, bring him back so he could be executed. The American people needed closure. They needed a way to say, look, you can't just betray our country. They wanted to get back at the villain, essentially, because Benedict Arnold had become the villain of the revolution. Remember, he was very highly regarded by everybody in the colonies before he decided to go against that and become a traitor. Ultimately, it's interesting to think about Benedict Arnold because without him, it's entirely possible that there wouldn't be a United States of America today. So his heroics at the Battle of Valcour Island, his heroics at Saratoga, his heroics during that raid at Danbury, all influential aspects of the American Revolution. And it's possible that if he wasn't there to spearhead those events, who knows how the war shakes out. But on the other hand, with him, there might not have been a American Revolution, a successful American Revolution. So if he had succeeded where he failed, and if John Andre never gets captured, then there might not be a United States of America. So it's kind of a duality there, as all interesting things are. So as you think back on Benedict Arnold, the villain, and Benedict Arnold, the traitor, always remember the human reasons why he did it. So going back to our original question, was it nature or nurture that is the ultimate cause of behaviors, for Benedict Arnold, you got to remember all those environmental factors that led to his betrayal. Okay, the successes of Alcor Island, the wealth he had before he started the Revolutionary War, okay, putting his heart and soul into the battle, the raid at Danbury, okay, the injury that he suffered at Saratoga, him running into Peggy Shippen and getting married to her. So all of those are environmental factors, kind of that nurture factor, but also keep in mind that this was a man who was able to still go through all that and end up betraying his country anyway. So was it nature or nurture, or was it a combination of both, as most things are? And for me, at least, the last reason why Benedict Arnold is an interesting story to tell is that he's an example of how the true enemies of the United States, the real enemies, and the real threat to the United States has always been, and maybe will always be, from within, not from without. A modern message indeed. If you like this episode of the podcast, or any of the previous episodes, you can leave a rating or review on whatever platform you're listening to it on. I'm told this helps spread the podcast to people who might be interested in listening to it somehow. So that would be fantastic if you could do that. If you didn't like the episode, you can leave me an angry tweet and we can talk about why it was terrible. Ultimately, I'm just glad you're out there listening. So that being said, thanks for listening.